Hello. Over the last few weeks, people around the world have been talking about the death of George Floyd. And in the last couple days, people have been talking a lot about the police use of chokeholds and whether these are appropriate, whether these should be banned. And I thought that was a topic worth discussing and exploring because it's something that legislators are making proposals about. And I think we should all be better informed about what's happening in our government. So lots of people are talking about chokeholds. However, most people don't know the first thing about chokeholds. And so if you can't articulate the difference between the two fundamental types of chokeholds and how they're applied, and the difference between them and a headlock, then you really don't know the first thing about chokeholds. And that's fine, right? There are lots of things I don't know. There's lots of things that you don't know. But the danger is that when people are advocating for legislation or regulations about X and they don't really know anything about X, that can be a bit dangerous. And so it's important to be educated about these things and not make rash decisions or emotional decisions when we're talking about these sorts of subjects. So perhaps this video will be helpful. And whether you ultimately agree with me or not, that's fine. We can talk about that. But I do want to provide something of some basic information and then my thoughts on the subject. So in a nutshell, there are two fundamental types of chokeholds. There's what's called an air choke sometimes, where there is interference with the airflow through the trachea. And then there is what is often called blood choke, carotid choke, where the carotid arteries that take blood to the brain are restricted so that the blood flow can't happen properly, and the person then blacks out. They're able to breathe throughout the entire thing, but then they go unconscious. So those are the two basic types of chokes that we're going to be talking about. And then these are differentiated from a headlock. A headlock is what the bully in elementary school put you in on the playground, right? You wrap his arm around your head and squeeze, and this hurts and it's unpleasant, but it doesn't really interfere with breathing or consciousness, not to any significant degree. So a headlock is something different. Okay, so let's start off with the first one, which is the air choke. So as I mentioned, an air choke is when there is pressure placed against the trachea. This is usually some sort of force directly in, or very often force perpendicular to the neck being pushed straight into the trachea to the point where the person then cannot breathe or cannot breathe normally. And this sort of air choke is dangerous, right? Not only because you're interfering with people's breathing, but the problem with the air choke is that even after it's released, the effect doesn't just simply disappear. It's not like it's over and everything's back to normal. Because when you restrict someone's trachea to a significant degree, you can damage the trachea. And so while the person can't breathe during the time of the choke, right, we know we can hold our breath for a while, but when the choke is released, the person may be able to breathe again, but there may be underlying damage, minor or significant, to the trachea. So many years ago, I was at a martial arts school and I was grappling and rolling around fighting with some guys. And one eager young man put on a choke. It was an air choke, and he really wrenched that into my trachea. And so I tapped out and stopped. But for the next few days, every time I swallowed, and we swallow all day long, every time I swallowed, there was pain in my trachea. Now that was relatively minor. It sucked, but it was relatively minor. If you have more severe damage to the trachea, to the cartilage in the trachea, that can be really a big problem. And I've heard of stories where a person had damage to their trachea and they were fine initially afterwards. I mean, they were in pain, but they were able to breathe. But then the swelling that resulted from that damage interfered with their breathing, and they died later on. So this is the big danger with air chokes that we have to be aware of and to understand what an air choke is. Now, the blood choke, as I mentioned, is where pressure is placed along primarily the two carotid arteries that run up the side of the neck on either side of the trachea, so that blood flow is interfered with, and the brain doesn't get enough blood. And when this happens, you typically have to put pressure on both sides of the neck for this to happen. And so when people are doing this, you can place an arm around the neck so that both sides of the arm are, the forearm and the upper arm are restricting both sides of the neck. There are ways that you can pull, down and over with a person's jacket or shirt and restrict that, or putting pressure on one side of the neck while the shoulder of the person is restricting the other side. These are different ways that you can create a blood choke. And what happens with a blood choke then is that the brain actually, it's because of the loss of glucose, not actually oxygen, that the person will pass out. And so if this is applied within 3 to 5 seconds, the person will pass out. They will lose consciousness, they will lose muscular control and fall over if they're not already on the ground or being held up. And when the blood choke is released, when the person lets go, the blood flow immediately resumes and consciousness comes back, and the person most of the time is perfectly fine. If you were like me when you were in middle school and you figured out how you could hyperventilate and, excuse me, and pass yourself out, this was a game that we played, not the best game, not one I would encourage, but it's a similar phenomenon, right? You pass out and then you slowly come back, and it takes you a little while to get your bearings and figure out where you are, but then you're pretty much fine. So with the blood choke this is actually a relatively safe thing. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu schools all around the world are doing this every day, and you're not really supposed to pass people out, but it happens from time to time, and people are usually fine. The blood choke is a relatively safe choke. Now, there are also a lot of air chokes that happen in those schools, and most of the time people are fine because the folks doing them know how to apply them and are ready to immediately release them when the person indicates that they want to have it released. What we have to understand about blood chokes, though, is while it does interfere with blood flow to the brain, there's no real damage to the brain. Cell death from a lack of glucose and actually then of oxygen later on is going to happen after restraint for minutes, not seconds. So you can't, with several seconds cause any sort of brain damage. You'd have to keep that on for minutes, and you'd have to keep that on for about 10 minutes completely tight, and then a person could actually go into a coma or die. And so that's the thing to understand about blood chokes. Okay. And then very quickly, headlocks, as I mentioned, headlocks are something that are completely different. No one wants to be in a headlock, it hurts, but it's not really restricting breath or consciousness. Okay, so should police be allowed to use these types of chokeholds? My opinion, yes. In certain situations, yes, and I'll explain why. I think a lot of times people think about police trying to restrain some wily teenager who's just trying to slip away and run, or a protester who's standing defiantly and refuses to leave the street. And in that sort of situation, yeah, pulling an air choke on someone like that and doing that severely has no place and is quite inappropriate. But police deal with a lot of other situations that can be very dangerous and life-threatening. And so they can often have to deal with people who might be much larger, much stronger, much more fit, much more motivated than they are, in a sense, who are trying to disarm them and kill them, right? And so you have police officers who are literally in a life and death situation where quite literally their lives are on the line. And if they don't do whatever it takes to stop this person, they are going to die. And so let me give you a scenario where you have a criminal who knocks a police officer down to the ground. Police officer gets knocked to the ground. He's got his big heavy belt, so it's hard to move around on the ground. He's on his back, and this larger person climbs on top of him, maybe striking him, and is trying to remove his pistol, is trying to disarm him. And looking at this situation, the person on the bottom and any bystander is going to realize if that man on top gets a hold of that gun, that police officer is probably dead, right? And that could be in a matter of seconds that he could pull that firearm out and kill that police officer. And so what if a second police officer comes along, sees this scenario, and comes up from behind? What should that police officer do? In that sort of situation, he or she only has seconds to act to potentially save the life of the first police officer. And in that sort of situation, putting an arm around the throat of the assailant and pulling back very hard directly against his trachea with a hard, severe air choke might be the best thing to do in that situation. Now, I'm not giving advice to police officers about how to handle scenarios. I just made up this scenario to illustrate a point. But if the second police officer has only seconds to act, what should he or she do? Trying to wrestle this first person off, it's likely not going to work very well. And especially if that person is again, bigger and stronger. And so what do you do in that situation? This could be the most effective way to remove a very severe threat. And what's the alternative? The alternative is, either to go down in escalation to try to pull this person off, which is probably not going to work, or pull out your mag light and smash him across the head and knock him unconscious. That would be another alternative, right? And maybe that situation would require it, but that would be a severe or serious jump in escalation. That would be a much more dangerous thing to do. Now, when people say that these chokes are dangerous, the air choke, yeah, air choke is dangerous. But lots of things that police officers do are dangerous, right? Tasing someone is dangerous. Slamming someone to the ground is dangerous. Shooting someone is dangerous, but there are scenarios where we recognize that these things are necessary. So it wouldn't make sense to say, well, this is dangerous, therefore police officers should never do that. Police officers are in the business of dangerous. I think that if we talk about banning chokeholds, what we're doing is talking about removing certain levels of non-lethal force from the arsenal of a police officer, right? Police officers can use a variety of methods to restrain or stop a threat, from grabbing someone's wrist to grabbing their body, all the way up to shooting someone. And if you remove certain things along the way, if you remove tasers because tasers are dangerous, well, then the police officers have to either use less force, which might be insufficient, or make a jump to more extreme force, and the same with chokes. And so I think that by removing certain tools that a police officer has, the danger is you leave them either more exposed or encourage them to use more lethal or more dangerous force. Now, all that being said, should police officers be trained in what chokes are, how to use them, their relative dangers? Absolutely. Every police officer should know the two different types of chokes, how to apply them, and if pressure is put on someone's throat, severe, significant pressure directly on someone's trachea, that needs to be monitored to make sure that that person is going to be okay after the choke is released. Now, all of this then leads us to the discussion, I think, of George Floyd. And I think, well, I know that many people were looking at this situation and saying, yes, this is absolutely terrible. No one's condoning this. No one's excusing the conduct of the police officer. But there are people that I've heard saying, I don't understand exactly what happened or why he died. Because while he's saying, I can't breathe, if you can speak the words, I can't breathe, if you can talk in a normal voice, there can't be that much trauma directly to your trachea. And police officers and security know that very often people will say, I can't breathe when they're being restrained, either out of an attempt to get away, and I'm not going to say Mr. Floyd was doing that, or because someone's sitting on them and they're having a little bit of trouble breathing and they're uncomfortable. But if you can utter the words, I can breathe, many people are going to say, well, then clearly you can breathe at least fairly well. So it didn't seem to be an air choke. And I've heard people also say, there's the pressure on the one side of the neck, but pressure on the one side of the neck usually will not accomplish a blood choke. You need to have pressure on both sides of the neck to knock a person unconscious. Now, we do know that Mr. Floyd did go unconscious after a period of time. So there are people looking at that saying, I don't understand what happened. I'm not even sure this was a choke. And weren't there other complicating factors involved? And so these are people who are not trying to excuse the conduct of the police officers, but rather to say, I don't understand what's going on because this doesn't look like a regular choke to me. And so therefore to say we should ban chokeholds seems to be an odd reaction. Now, I am not a physician. I didn't perform the autopsy. I read the autopsy report, and this is my estimation of what happened. If I had to guess, this is what I would guess actually happened. That the big problem here was the prolonged pressure on Mr. Floyd's neck for, was it almost 9 minutes? And so it turns out that physicians have found, or studies have found that we didn't talk about it, but you also have a carotid sinus. And if there is pressure, if there's prolonged pressure on the carotid sinus, and that is coupled with pressure on the artery, an artery or arteries in the neck, that combination of pressure can then lead to a person going unconscious. And if the pressure is maintained after that, the person can die. And so if I had to guess, and this is, again, not authoritative, but my best effort to understand what happened, my guess is that the extreme pressure of the man kneeling on Mr. Floyd's neck combined both some pressure on an artery in his neck with the carotid sinus, and that combination, in addition to some health issues that he had, I read that he had the precursor to the COVID-19 virus. There are also other substances and health issues that he had, that pressure was what probably resulted in that. Now, if he hadn't been sick, would the same thing have happened? If he hadn't had certain substances in his body, would the same thing have happened? None of us know that, right? But what we can say is that what the police officer did by having such extreme pressure on his neck for such a long time, and most importantly, after he was unconscious, was inexcusable. So again, my point here isn't really about the George Floyd case, right? That's very complicated. We should be talking about that. But that if we're going to talk about chokeholds, we should talk about them in an intelligent and informed way. And if you want to know more about this, maybe a little hard to find, but some of you could maybe get in touch with me. A number of years ago, there was a journal called the Journal of Asian Martial Arts, and they ran a very good article by a physician in conjunction with a martial artist about carotid chokes and the physiology of this and the applications of these and the dangers of these. It's an excellent article that if you really want to get a much more detailed analysis, you could look into. So please feel free to share your thoughts with me if you think I'm wrong about any of this. Please let me know. I certainly recognize there are things that I can miss, but I wanted to offer my perspective and a little information about this subject so that when people are talking about legislation or regulations about police and chokeholds, that they have a little better knowledge and understanding of the issue. Thank you.